Hello Internet, welcome back to another video. This one's going to be a follow-up to my last video, which was talking about neutral density filters, what they are, why you might want to use them. This one, as you can probably guess, is about GoPros and GoPro settings. I did a little bit of research leading up to this video and just wanted to see what kind of videos were already out there, because I figured there would be quite a few talking about GoPros since we all use them. I'm not going to go into all the super technical stuff about all the different settings and what they mean and everything like that. If you want to look at a series of videos that will go into that a little bit more in depth, Joshua Bardwell's done a good series of videos. I'll link that in the description, so go check that out if you're not really that familiar with all this stuff. I'm more just going to go over the way I set up a GoPro and why I might choose certain settings for certain situations and that kind of thing. So once we've gone over my GoPro settings and the few things that I might change and that kind of thing, we're going to quickly jump on my computer. We're going to go over color grading and the sort of things you can do to make your GoPro footage look a little bit better when you're editing it. And then I'm going to quickly go over my export settings. I personally edit in Adobe Premiere Pro, but you could probably apply these sorts of settings to just about any editing program, so hopefully they're fairly universal. I'll preface this by saying it's probably not going to be that interesting. You'll be a little bit surprised that I actually don't do a whole lot to GoPros, and that's actually kind of my first tip. Like, in general, I would say that you pretty much just want to let the GoPro do its thing. There are a few exceptions to that, which I'll go over in a minute, but in general, letting the not trying to get too fancy with playing with the camera settings and making it only work in really specific situations would be my advice, because there's going to be too many situations where you set it, if you set it up with like a specific ISO, a specific frame rate and that kind of thing, it's only going to work in like the exact lighting conditions that you set it up. And I think that the minor differences that you get between setting up a GoPro perfectly and just letting it, run on completely default settings, it's generally just more important to get the shot. And this is something that became really evident when I was in Tasmania for that video that I put up last week. My friend that I was flying with, Noah, he was playing with shutter speeds and all that kind of thing when we were out flying and doing some of that long range stuff. And there were a couple of shots that he got that were just completely unusable. And I mean, it's an easy mistake to make. Like, I've done the same thing plenty of times. You set the GoPro up, you think it's going to be on ideal settings, and it's not quite right. But it kind of just highlighted to me that, like, my GoPros weren't set up anything special, and I was pretty happy with the footage that I got. I know it could have been a little bit % better here and there, but for the most part, letting your camera just do its thing and not thinking too much about settings and just going out and flying for the sake of having fun and for the sake of just getting shots and then doing what you can to make them look a little bit better later on is probably more important. And on that point, the main thing that I will suggest that everyone should change on a GoPro is to run them in the flat color profile, which is in the Pro-Tune settings. The reason for this is it makes the picture out of the GoPro initially look a lot more dull. You've got less color saturation, you've got less contrast and all that kind of thing. But what it does is it brings it closer to what in professional videography you would call like a raw video file or a D-Log video file or S-Log or whatever brand you're coming from. And if you go and look up those terms, you'll see that a raw file from most pro cameras will just look like, they almost look black and white. They're just completely flat. And the reason for that is that it allows you as much scope to do color grading to it and play with the colors, and you've got more detail in shadows. It just generally allows you more freedom to play with the file later on. So the biggest benefit of that is that it means that more of your shots are going to be more usable more of the time. So if you just set that setting on flat, I also suggest setting the sharpness to at a maximum medium. I wouldn't set it any higher than medium. If anything, set it on low, because you can always add sharpness later on. I think that's the general rule here, is like, don't go too hard on the settings in general, because you can always make stuff more contrasty or more vibrant colors or sharper or whatever it is that you want in your editing. If we want to go over some of the settings that you might actually want to play with to make a camera look a certain way, the first one I would look at would be white balance. Now if we go into the settings here, you can see that this is your WB white balance. Now as a reference, this 5500K is around about what sunlight should be. So if you're talking about a really sunny day, there's no clouds or anything in the sky, the sun is, you know, it's the middle of the day, so it's not like really low in the sky and it's not really orangey yet. You're looking at around about 5500K is sort of the temperature of the sun, of the color. And you can see as you go down, it changes, it makes it more blue. If you go up, it makes it a lot warmer. Now, why you might want to play with this would be if you're flying on a day when it's sort of half cloudy and half sunny, and you go into an area where it's at 5500. So you take off in an area where it's nice and sunny. You can see on this white DJI charger, it's that's pretty much where it should be. So that, we know that it's meant to be white. This light that I'm in is supposed to be 5500. I think it's probably more like 5000. So if we go down to 4500, that's a little bit closer to white, but it's also a little bit blue. So the ideal setting is probably somewhere in between the two. But what will happen is the camera will sort of calibrate itself when you first start recording, and then you might fly around to an area that is cloudy and it doesn't have quite the same amount of warmth in the light because it's not getting direct sun, and then you'll find that your image will look a little bit more like that, which is not warm enough. And in that situation, if you're flying on a really cloudy day, you might want to set it to like 6000 or 6500 or something like that. So that basically explains why you might want to play with white balance. Although, to be honest, I find these days in general GoPro gets it pretty spot on. You would just find that occasionally you'll be flying in an area and you'll notice that the colors might change midway through a flight. And if you really want to avoid that, then that's the only time you might want to actually manually set your white balance. So then the next one that we might want to look at would be ISO. So let's go in and have a look at ISO in here. So ISO minimum and ISO maximum. ISO is the sensitivity to light that the image sensor has. So the lower the number, the less sensitive it is to light. The higher the number, the more sensitive. Now, the reason why you might want to go to your lowest ISO setting is you might be looking for a specific shutter speed, and if you set a manual shutter speed, then you're going to have to play with your ISO because that's the only other parameter that you've got that adjusts the exposure of your GoPro. The reason why you don't want to have a really high ISO is that basically to make a camera, especially these little cameras, more sensitive to light and running a really high ISO, you just end up with a really grainy image, and it actually degrades the sharpness and the just overall quality of the image. So if I go to set my minimum ISO at 6400, you can see straight away that you've got all this digital noise and it just looks like rubbish basically. So you can see as it goes down, it becomes a lot cleaner. You go all the way down to 100, and sharpness is a lot more improved. So basically you always want to have the lowest ISO you can get away with. That would be pretty much my rule. The only reason why you might want to increase it to something like 1600 or 3200 or something really high like that is if you're flying at night. So this is some flying around in a car park. It's reasonably poorly lit, even though it looks like it's fairly lit up in this video. And this was with the ISO set to 1600, and this is with a GoPro session. So the next value that we're going to look at is shutter speed. Again, I recommend just leaving this on auto, but if you do have access to an ND filter, you're flying on a really sunny day, and especially if you're doing filming of something, so you're filming a car or something like that, having a lower shutter speed is going to give you a slightly nicer image because you're going to get image blur. If you want to know more about this sort of theory, please go back and watch my video on ND filters because I go into that and show some examples of lower shutter speeds and everything. So the last setting that we're going to quickly go over is Eevee Comp. Now, I'll say from the start that this is definitely a setting that I think you should leave on auto for the majority of the time, but if you do want to play with it, I'll quickly try and explain what it is. So basically, when a camera is set to any kind of auto setting, so it can automatically adjust its exposure or its ISO, like some of the settings we were just looking at, what it's going to try and do is to look at its overall scene that's in front of it and make the average exposure level across all of the different bright, dark areas and everything that it can see a mid-grey. Now, what I mean by a mid-grey is that it's trying to make the overall tone that it's seeing average out to be exactly halfway between completely black and completely white. So it's what they call 18% grey. Now, the reason why you might want to play with this is if you're filming something that is mostly black and you just leave Eevee Comp in the middle, it's going to overexpose it because it's seeing something that, like, the camera doesn't know that what it's looking at is black. And if the majority of the scene that's in front of it is black, then it's going to try and overexpose that and bring it up to be a grey. And the opposite is true if you're filming something that's white or very bright in general. It will look at what's in front of it and go, oh no, that's too bright, I need to bring it down. So at the moment the exposure level is pretty much correct because the top half of the screen is white and the bottom half of the screen is black. So that evens out to be a mid-grey, more or less. If I move that out of the frame, you can see that this dark area, see, it was darker at the bottom. I move it down, it overexposes that, and that's not what this looks like. This matte that's on the ground here is actually black. So if I move my exposure comp down to like -2, then that gets a lot darker. And then the opposite, if we've got it on negative, and then we look at something that's white, then this is making it look a little bit more grey. That definitely doesn't look like that in real life. So if I move this up to positive, then that's actually getting closer to being white. So the easiest way to think of exposure compensation is you're essentially just telling the camera what's in front of it. So if you're filming a black car on a black road and everything is really dark, you might want to adjust it down negative a little bit. But the reason why I don't think that this is a setting that you should play with is that these are only slight changes that are going to happen, especially on a GoPro. It doesn't actually give you that much scope to play with the exposure compensation a huge amount. And any adjustments that you might make in the camera can easily be adjusted in editing. And I think that it's a lot easier and it's a lot better to just leave it in the middle, go out, get the shot, and then you can come back and you can adjust it a little bit later. So let's jump on the computer and we'll have a quick look at some color grading for just basic GoPro footage. We might go over some of the footage from my Tassie video last week, and then hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea of the sorts of things you can do to make your footage look a little bit better once you've already filmed it. Let's quickly go over some of the things that I've done to color grade these clips. This is all the clips from my Tassie trip from the video I posted last week. So the first thing that makes my life a little bit easier is I use adjustment layers that you can see here, which basically sit over the top of all the video files, and I apply my changes to these, and then I can turn them on and off or move them around or duplicate them or whatever for each thing. So I can turn off them and then we can quickly go through. So this is what all the video files looked like straight out of the camera. So like that one's a good example. So we'll turn the settings back on. So that's the difference. This is your basic color correction palette. This is all going to be in the middle. So if you're just looking at something when it's like that, they're all going to be set to, and this is when I was talking about a GoPro, just leaving it on standard settings. The GoPro that I was running the whole time I was in Tassie was just set to fight color profile, 1080, 60 FPS, super view. That's it. I didn't change anything else for the entire time that I was there. I didn't use an ND filter. I did nothing. Just literally left the quad, left all of the cameras completely alone. So that's what a standard image out of a GoPro is going to look like. If I select that, now you can see that's what it looks like after these changes. So what I'm essentially trying to do is, this is a sunrise, like I'm flying into the sun, and I wanted to make it look a little bit warmer. So you've got this slider up here, which is just temperature. So what I was talking earlier about white balance, it's just a similar sort of thing. So you can sort of change that. You can make it look colder and more blue versus a little bit warmer. So that's that one that I've played with there. Exposure, I mean, it was a little bit too bright. If I turn that off, you can see it's a little bit too bright. The thing with GoPro footage in general is that there's very little you can do to actually play with it. Like if you get the shot completely wrong, and this is why I don't think that messing with the settings in the GoPro is really that fruitful, because if you get the settings wrong and the shot is like completely overexposed or completely underexposed, there's not a whole lot you can do to fix it. So that's why I kind of think like you can tweak a shot if it's like roughly correct. You can tweak it and make it look a little bit nicer, which is what I've done here. But you can't completely fix something that was shot incorrectly. So in general, just leaving the shots, leaving the camera alone and letting it, you know, do its thing, and then just sort of tweaking the shots afterwards, I think for me is the best way to do it. And all these sliders, I mean, you know, I'll quickly go through some of the shots here to show you what I've done to achieve the look that I got. But in general, I think you don't want to copy what are other people's settings, because you'll see that each of these shots even are all completely different in terms of like each of these shots even from my video are completely different in terms of like how I've color graded them. And so trying to just like take someone's settings and copy and paste them onto your videos just isn't going to work. The best thing to do, like there's not that many sliders here. Get a video of your own, jump into the program and find the section that allows you to do basic color correction like this, and just play with the sliders. Just go like extremely one way or the other, you know, and just experiment. So that's going to be the easiest way to learn what these settings do. Like this one's highlights. It's pretty self-explanatory. It's going to bring down it's going to bring down the sections that are like not just white, but the higher up in the exposure level. So if you've got like a sky is almost a little bit overexposed, you can sort of bring some of that detail back by dropping the highlights down like that. So if I leave it in the middle, the clouds are really white. If I drop it back down, you get a little bit more detail in these cloudy areas here. So yeah, I'm not going to go through every single slider and, you know, what I think they should be. My overall advice is to just jump into the program, whichever one you use, and have a play with it. Basically, just figure out what changes do what, and then, you know, you can figure out what is going to make each of your clips look the best. There's a couple of tips that I will say. In general, I try to make sure that things like the saturation levels and the contrast levels and that kind of thing are consistent across each of your clips. So I personally like a really contrasty image. And so, you know, I've gone for like really deep blacks in most of my clips. You know, I don't really turn saturation up that much, because I find that when you increase in contrast a lot, it sort of naturally turns up the saturation anyway, or at least has the same kind of effect. Another quick tip, which I find is quite useful for me, because I go for that really contrasty look in clips. You'll find this clip right here is a classic example. A lot of the time with the GoPro, because it's having to adjust its exposure really constantly when we're doing our freestyle, like from pointing at the ground, which is quite dark, to pointing at the sky, which is really bright, is you'll get these really dramatic fluctuations in its exposure levels. So like when the GoPro is looking at the sky like it is here, to when it's looking at the ground like it is there, that's a big jump. And so you'll get this like period of time where it's set its exposure while it's looking at the sky for the sky, and then it will come to looking at the ground like this, and the ground all here will be completely dark. So one thing I do occasionally is I'll adjust my color grading for both settings, so for when it's here and then for when it's here separately, and then I'll cut the adjustment layer and just add a dissolve, like so it just sort of blends between the two smoothly, so when you actually just watch it back, it just looks completely natural. You can't tell, and it looks like it's consistent exposure level, because you're basically sort of equalizing the two exposure levels for the two sections of the same clip. So I mean, that's actually really it as far as color grading for GoPro footage. Like I said, it's pretty basic footage, so there isn't a huge amount you can do with it. The only things you can do are really just going to be something you learn through trial and error. Like I know this clip, I actually increased, this is not something I do very often, but increase the saturation a lot, because this right here with this really blue lake down here, that's actually what it looked like in real life. But for some reason the GoPro didn't really show it that much. It looked really dull, it looked more like that. That's sort of more like straight out of the camera, and I'll turn that off. Yeah, that's what it looked like straight out of the camera, but then like that's the difference between just adjusting it to what you think it should look like or what you remember it looking like, and it coming out of the camera. But this clip here is a good example of using the GoPro flat color profile, as opposed to if I were to set it to the standard, which I think it's just called GoPro, the color profile, as opposed to flat, then this area here that's in the shadow would be almost completely black, because it naturally turns the contrast and ratios and everything up really high, and you wouldn't have the option to play with the shadows or to bring out more detail in darker areas or whatever. So it's better to, that's why I say, it's better to shoot in the flatter color profile like this, and then you can play with these settings later on. Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably about it as far as color grading goes. It should hopefully be enough information for you guys to do your own sort of research and figure out how you want to make your videos look. The next thing would be export settings. So these clips were shot in 1080p, like I said, 1080/60. You can see here the source 1920 by 1080 at 59.94, but I actually exported it as a 4K file. So the reason I do that is basically to get around the issues with YouTube compression. What YouTube does is that it allocates a higher bit rate to higher resolutions. So if you upload a 1080p video file versus a 4K video file, it will prioritize those 4K video files that people upload to be higher quality, basically, than 1080p. And that's why when you export a 1080p file and look at it on your computer, like the rendered file, and then you upload it to YouTube and look at it on YouTube, it looks way worse on YouTube. That's because it's automatically allocated a lower bit rate. And you can discuss all day what you think the bit rate of YouTube compression is, but it seems to change all the time. It's really variable. No one really knows exactly how their algorithm works. But generally speaking, exporting something, there's no downside to exporting something at a higher resolution than what you recorded at. There's, even though it's not the native resolution, as long as the scaling is the same, as long as the aspect ratio is the same, it really doesn't matter. And it just means that, when someone watches back my video file in 4K on YouTube, it actually just looks the way it should look, which is it looks more like a properly rendered 1080p file. So you do get some benefit from shooting in a high resolution on a GoPro, but then it limits either your field of view, so you can't run super view, which I think is a must for mini quad footage. So you either can't run super view or you can't run the higher frame rates. So for me, I think it's better to shoot just 1080/60 super view all the time. If you're lucky enough to have a Hero 6, and I use these just for specific filming things, not for normal freestyle flying, because they're a bit too expensive if you bin it, but you can shoot, with one of these, I'll shoot 2.7K 60 super view. It's just because this has higher capabilities, so you can't run those settings on a GoPro session, so I'm fine to just shoot 1080/60. There are situations where a lower frame rate can look better, but I personally think overall it's better to shoot. Most footage looks better at a higher frame rate. I think most of it looks better at 60 FPS. The other advantage of shooting at higher frame rates is that it gives you the option to do a little bit of basic slow-mo as well if you want to. So again, it's coming back to that flexibility thing. Yeah, elaborating on my argument from about running low shutter speeds with ND filters and everything, if you're in one of those situations where you really want to get nice motion blur and everything, then running a lower frame rate and a lower shutter speed might be the better way to go. But again, that's very specific situations where I'm trying to give you guys, information on the best overall settings. So there's nothing wrong with a good 1080p video file, 60 FPS, and then just upload it at the highest possible resolution that you can manage. The only real downside to doing 4K video files is, one, they're going to take a lot longer to render. So if your computer's not super powerful, it might take a little bit longer to to pump out that file. And the same with your internet connection. Obviously the video file, like this is only a 2-minute video, or sorry, 3-minute video, I think it is, 2.5-minute video, 750 meg. If I drop that down to 1080p, it's only 300 meg, so it's 2 and a bit times the size the video file. So if your internet connection's not that fast, and you're really limited on how much time you can spend uploading, then maybe you want to go for the lower resolution. So yeah, so that's been it. I hope that's been useful. I'm a little bit out of it today. This has taken me a really long time to record this video, and I keep forgetting things that I've said. So if I've left things out, please let me know. Ask questions. I'll respond as best I can. But yeah, hopefully that's given you some useful info on how you guys can set things up for yourself, and what might work well for you. And yeah, I'll again, if there's other topics that you want me to cover in future videos, then leave it in the comments, and we'll cover them in a future video. Thanks for watching.